Hello, woodworkers. Welcome to the February program of NWA. We are again doing just a virtual program from our shop and learning center on Railroad Avenue in Albany. We know that it appears that the COVID environment is changing, and we're hoping that if these trends continue, we'll be able to get our members back in our shop, actually for these programs. But we've got to take it carefully. I would like to now at this time introduce Carl Stoner, our Vice President for Programs, who will have a couple of announcements and then introduce tonight's presenter, who is one of our wind whisperers of the organization. Okay, Carl?
Thank you, Irv. Good evening. We are being very careful here, but we are taking off our masks when we're speaking. We have a very exciting time coming up at the end of March, 26th and 27th, the showcase in Saratoga and Totally Turning. We are in desperate need of volunteers to help with Totally Turning. And if you can volunteer, please do. You can call Pam Bushings. There's her phone number for volunteering for Totally Turning. And I'd like to introduce Pam Curtis, who will now tell you a little bit about what we need for Showcase.
All right, thank you. I didn't know I'd have to speak myself, but I've written this down. So anyway, I'm in charge of the Showcase store, and I want you to think of donating, if you could, a quality project for our Showcase store. We are very short on stock because we did so well in our sale at the Shaker Museum. So we don't have a lot of inventory. There haven't been a lot of members coming back yet, but they are trickling in. And also, our members can put their woodworking in the store for a 30% commission. Please see the Northeastern Woodworkers webpage for the application. Also, if you can work a shift at the store, please contact me. My phone number is on the website. And this is Pam Curtis, not Pam Busey. So, also, SIGs. If you want money for your SIGs, anything you make and you designate it for the SIGs, 100% of the money goes back to the SIGs. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pam. And now I'd like to introduce Dave Mobley, one of our founding members. He's quite an artist working with routers. He will be demonstrating many clever ways of using routers without the table and some jigs. Ready, Dave?
Yes. Thank you, Carl. And can you, are we all set up on that end? Sure. Okay, great. Just to warm things up, get warmed up here, I'm going to start out by doing a simple operation that's one of the most common operations with a handheld router. Is this live? Okay. What I'm going to do is put a profile on the edge of a board. So let me get plugged in here. It's always good to make sure that your router is off when you plug it in. That's happened. It's happened a couple of times that I have failed to do that, and it's a big surprise. So let's get going here. So as I said, this is one of the most common operations that people use handheld routers for. And if we could switch over here, maybe you can see the profile that we put. A simple roundover with a little bit of a reveal on the top. But that's certainly not all that you can do with a router. In fact, some of you may not use your routers very much because you're not aware of all of the things that you can do. So let's talk a little bit.
Dave, I just want to interrupt for a minute.
Yes.
What I failed to say is we are on our YouTube broadcast. We do have chat room open. So if you have any questions for Dave, go to chat room and we have somebody monitoring it. And maybe we can ask you questions.
We may have some technical difficulties there, but bear with it. So Carl, if we could go over to the PowerPoint. So a number of woodworkers I know have routers, and they're sitting in a box at home and are not being used. One of the reasons may be that you're not aware of everything that a router can do. So let's talk about a few of those things. Next slide, please. A lot of joinery can be done with the router, and these pictures show a lot of these pictures show a setup with a router table, but you can do a lot of these, of course, with a handheld router as well. One example, simple rabbet. You might do this for a picture frame, for example. Another example, grooves. That would be either a dado or a slot groove. Very useful, for example, for bookshelves. Other joinery, tenons. Easily trim tenons precisely and repeatedly with a router setup. Box joints, with the proper jig, you can make very accurate box joints with your router. And as we saw, one of the very common things is shaping edges, putting a profile, for example, on the edge of a tabletop. With a template and a template following bit, you can precisely cut to a variety of patterns. And you're not limited to straight cuts as you would be with a table saw, for example. You can do all kinds of fancy curved shapes. Back in the joinery department, you can make rail and stile joints. This is for, as you might know, for frame and panel cabinet doors. And another very useful thing is planing large surfaces. There are a lot of other things that you can do if you have a plunge router that beyond having a router with a fixed base. For example, mortises, previous. Go back, please. Thank you.
We're on YouTube now. Okay, I'm sorry.
Next one. Thank you. Mortises, you can do stopped grooves, can do inlay pockets, fluting, inside pattern cutting, a wide variety of things that you can do with your plunge router. So there are several types of routers on the market. And here we have a few examples. And the router that you choose is going to depend on the application. Handheld router, one you can hold in one hand, and these are great for doing small detail work. And on our YouTube channel, for example, you can see an example of Ray Puffer using these for doing some inlay work. The limitation of this is that they typically only have a 1/4 inch collet, so you can only use small bits safely with this kind of router. But again, for detail work, very, very useful, lightweight, and so easy to move around. Switching to the other end of things, heavy-duty router. This is a 3 1/4 horsepower router, and it's plenty heavy. While this is set up for handheld use, for me, it's too big and awkward for regular handheld use. So for me, what this router is best for is router table. We have this in the router table at the NWA shop. Works very well and can handle heavy-duty bits. For in-between work and a lot of the handheld work, what you want to look for is a mid-range router. And there's a wide variety of router brands in this 2 to 2 1/4 horsepower range. This happens to be a DeWalt, Porter Cable, Makita, Bosch. There's a wide variety of manufacturers who make good routers in this power range. And again, for general duty work, I'd recommend starting with that size router. Let's turn now and talk some about router bits. Could you turn that? So if we could zoom in just a little bit there. Super. So starting here, this is the simplest common bit, straight bit. And of course, as you can see, it gives a straight cut. Also what gives you a straight cut are these spiral bits. And in fact, I've really gotten where I prefer a spiral bit over a straight cut bit, because what you get here is a shearing action as you go around. If you'll notice, the spiral here is going in different directions in between these two bits. So this happens to be an upcut spiral bit. So it's lifting the chips out of the recess as you're cutting. So it gives a nice surface on the bottom. This is a downcut spiral bit, and so as it's cutting, it's pushing the chips downward. You might think that this is a problem, that things will get compacted down in the groove, but that doesn't really happen. And what this results in is a very nice cut at the top surface of the cut. And these spiral bits come in a wide variety of sizes. This is a little 1/8" diameter. Again, nice for doing some detail work. And that's a 1/4" shank. So that would fit in your handheld router. This is a round nose, or traditionally often called a core box bit. Nice for doing fluting, and could also be used for putting a cove on the edge of a cut. This is a V-groove bit. Very nice for carving out lettering and giving sort of a chiseled, sort of imitation hand carved look. And then we have various profile bits available. This one is a round-over bit that was similar to the one that we started out with. And there's a whole variety of these profile bits that you can get for different kinds of effects on your edge. Finally, on this little board, here's a slot cutting bit. So this would cut not in the top of the surface, but would cut on the edge of a bit of a board. A couple of other styles to show you here. This is a pattern cutting bit. It has bearings on both the top and the bottom, straight cut. So again, you saw in the slides an example of following a template, and this could follow a template either on the top or the bottom of your working surface. And then a final example here, a rail and style set. Again, you saw this at work in one of the previous slides, again for making a face frame for a cabinet. The trick with this, I'll have to say, is getting these correctly lined up so that the two pieces fit firmly together and in line. Before we leave talking about bits, I want to show you an example of a kind of bit not to get. This bit was given to me by a manager of a tool repair shop. And someone came in with this broken bit And you can see that before it broke, it bent wildly. And that was because this bit is just simply too big for the shaft. It's a 1/4 inch shaft, but it's a very heavy bit. So I recommend never get a bit like that. If you're going to get a bit with a 1/4 inch shaft, then make sure that it's a relatively small bit in the cutting area as well. So, by the way, are we set up with the chat yet?
Question about what makes a bit a plunge style bit. Repeat the question.
To repeat the question we had here, what makes a bit a plunge style bit? Well, a lot of bits can be used in plunge. The spiral bits that I was talking about before are great for plunge work. For straight cutting bits, one of the features that is good for a plunge cut, and I don't know if you can see it, is this is good for mortising because it has a straight part across the middle that will clean out the middle or the bottom surface of the mortise quite cleanly. But plunge bits typically are going to be straight bits because with a profile, of course, as you go down, you're going to change the diameter of the bit. So I hope that answered that question. Did we have any others coming up? Well, let's go back to the PowerPoint. And let's skip ahead on to the next one. You know, I mentioned that one of the reasons people may not be using the router is that they're not familiar with what it can do. Another reason might be that you're afraid to use it. And that's really unnecessary. Like other power tools, you want to respect the tool, but once you learn how to use it, you can use it safely and without fear. For me, there's only a few things that you really have to keep in mind to work safely with the router. Every time that I start up a router, I go through a quick mental checklist. And those things, that list is a series of 5 questions. One question is, am I ready? Of course, that includes, you know, am I properly dressed so that I'm not going to get tangled up in anything? Am I focused? Am I feeling like doing the work safely? But it also includes protecting your ears and your eyes. So using safety glasses is preferably with side shields is, and I'll show you these safety glasses and the side shields, and hearing protection. So if you're ready, then the other things to check out, and if we can show this slide again briefly, is your router ready? Do you have the proper setup? Do you have the correct bit, the correct depth setting? Third is your workpiece secure. You don't want your workpiece moving around on you. Fourth is your jig or guide secure. Almost always you're going to be using something to guide the router in your work. The one exception is if you're working with a very small bit in a handheld router, then you can control that by hand. Otherwise, you need something to guide the router. And finally, do you have a clear pathway? Can you predict where your machine and where you're going to go, and is it clear to go there? So those are 5 things. As I go through demonstrations, I'll try to repeat those, but those keep you out of trouble if you can keep track of those things. Next chart, please. So, you'll be installing bits for very frequently. So it's important to learn up front how to install a bit correctly. First, make sure that your router is unplugged. Here we have a roundover bit. Here's an example of putting it in the collet too shallowly. You don't have it deep enough into the bit, into the collet, to make a secure hold on the bit. Here we have an example. We're getting too far into the bit, or into the collet, excuse me. 2 things. You'll notice at the bottom it's sticking out of the collet. That means it could be bottoming out in the base of the collet holder in your router. That's not good because you can't tighten it down effectively. And if you'll notice up at the top, we're going from the clear round part of the shaft into a part that is starting to flare out. And again, you don't want your collet going into the part that leaves the clear round part of the shaft. So the Goldilocks situation is the one on the far right, and there we have just a little bit of space up at the top, and we're not bottoming out too far at the bottom. Another key thing to learn up front is the direction of the feed. This is a simple thing to memorize. If you can imagine going around a picture frame, for example, if you're on the outside of the picture frame, and this is with a handheld router, you want to go counterclockwise. If you were on the inside, you would want to go clockwise. That is referred to as a conventional cut. If you were to go in the opposite direction, that's called a climb cut. Climb cuts are generally dangerous because it can pull the router out of your hand. Depth of cut. A general guideline, you don't want to try to take a deep cut all at one time. General guideline, go no more than 1/4 of an inch deep per pass. And if your cutter diameter is less than 1/4 of an inch, don't go any deeper on any one pass than the diameter of the cutter. So an 1/8 inch cutter, only an 1/8 inch deep, and so forth. And you might even want to back off on that if you're working on denser materials. A quick note about bit burn. If you've used a router, you might notice that with some woods in particular, like maple and cherry, they're susceptible to getting a burn. And this is the same thing that happens with table saw, for example. Why is that? Well, in woodworking, the basic concept is that the chips that you're creating carry the heat away. So if you stop and you're not making chips, you're not carrying heat away, but you're still creating friction, and so you will result in burning the surface of the wood at that point. So how do you avoid that? Well, first of all, make sure your bits are sharp, and if you're moving steadily and you're still getting bit burn, what you want to do is increase the amount that the router is cutting on each little rotation. That's called the chip size. So if you're getting bit burn, and this may be counterintuitive to some people, you actually want to move faster. Again, you're creating more chips, and you're carrying the heat away more efficiently. You could also lower the RPM or go to a bit that has fewer cutting edges. So if you're using a 3-flute bit, for example, go to a 2-flute bit. Do we have a question?
We actually have two questions.
Okay, good.
First, you mentioned the climb cut. Is there ever a time when you should use it? Number one. And the second question is, for dovetail bits, more of a comment, that do they require a full depth cut? Is that correct?
Yes, so the first question was climb cuts. Is there ever any occasion where you would want to use a climb cut? And there are a few examples where you might use a climb cut and do it very carefully. And it would tend to be on using a router table where you're following a pattern, for example, and by doing a climb cut at the very end of a cut, for example, you might be able to trim out the end of a cut with and prevent tear out. Unfortunately, without demonstrating, that may be a little not be a real clear answer. But yes, there are a few occasions where climb cut used carefully is appropriate. The second question, if you remind me, was dovetails, full cut. And yes, that is an example where you will use a full depth of cut because kind of obviously if you don't, you're going to get a different pattern for your dovetail. But again, make sure that you've got a good solid setup or a jig because you're taking a lot of material off at one time in that case. Any other for now? Okay. And finally, going back to a chart here, feed rate. We talked just a minute ago about making sure that you're going fast enough to prevent burn. How fast is fast enough? Well, a good starting point is about 1 foot per 3 seconds. And I've noticed that people who are just starting out using a router tend to go slower than that because you're being careful, and that's understandable. But as you gain experience, you'll find that you can go faster and you'll get a better cut if you speed up just a little bit. So we talked about the bit types. As a reminder, straight bits, spirals. I didn't mention the dovetail bit, but I'm glad someone brought up a question about that. The core box or round nose, V-groove, and then the whole variety of profiles that you can make with profile bits. And we saw that some bits have a guide bearing and that serves as your way of controlling the pathway of the router. All right, with that, why don't we demonstrate a couple of other jigs. So over here, we have a jig for straight cut, and it's a simple jig, easy for you to make, and some of you may use this kind of jig for your circular saw as well. I use this for both. The idea here is that you set up your jig so that the guide here in the center is the correct offset to tell you where you're going to be cutting along the edge. On this edge, it's set up to run my circular saw down here, and it'll cut right to that edge. On this side, it's set up so that when I run my router down there, it'll be cutting on that edge. So let me set for a reasonable depth of cut here. So remember the 5 things that I was talking about before? First of all, is my router ready? It's set up with a straight cutting bit because I'm going to cut a slot down the length of this board. It's set up with a base that will follow my guide. It's a straight edge that will follow my guide here. So my router is set up, and I'll be plugging it in here in just a sec. Is my workpiece held down? My workpiece is held between bench dogs here, so that's secure. 3 is my jig or guide secure, and yes it is. And then, do I have a free pathway? This is the direction I'll be going, and everything is clear. And then, of course, the other thing is, am I ready? I have my safety glasses on, I have my ear protection on, and so I should be ready to go. So there we have it. And with routers, of course, the actual cut goes pretty fast. So you'll often find that you'll spend more time setting up the cut than you need to actually do the cut. But we have a nice clean groove there because we had a nice street guide to help us out. So let's switch. Let's say we want to instead make a doodle across the width of the board instead of cutting the board down the length of the board. So here we'll use this simple jig, and so this is I call it a right angle jig, and by lining up this groove with the place where I want to cut here, I'll know where I'm making my doodle. So here what we need to do is connect this to my workpiece. And again, let's go through a little checklist. Is my router ready? It's the same setup for the router that I used before. So that's ready. With my workpiece secure, it's once again held down on the bench. Is my jig or guide secure? Yep, I have that clamped down too. And do another clear pathway. This may seem trivial in this particular situation, but yes, I do have a clear pathway going across here. One thing I'm going to do is change where my code is, because I don't want that to be getting in the way as I'm doing. And finally, when I'm ready, I will be as soon as I put my earmuffs on. So once again, we're ready to go. Now I'm letting my router come to a stop before I pick it up and do anything else with it. And yes, that takes a few more seconds of time, but you know, most of us are not doing woodworking because we're doing production work. Most of us are doing it as a hobby. So what's the big rush? Better to spend just a few more seconds and be safe than risk being injured with it. So again, we've made a nice dado here. This is just a 1/2 inch, but let's say you had something more like 3/4 inch. You can imagine, you know, making dados for bookshelves. And now let's move over and look at another jig here. This is a jig for mortising. Let's say that you have a table leg, for example, and you want to put a mortise because you're going to put an apron for, it's going to be a table leg, and you need an apron under the tabletop. So this is a simple kind of mortising jig. There are several variations on this, but this is one that I think is pretty simple and useful. So these two guides will follow the surfaces of the table leg here, and I have a plunge router base on top of that jig so that I can start at one end of the mortise. I can plunge down and do the cut and then come back out. The capability of being able to cut into a piece of wood, move around, and cut something out internal is kind of unique to routers. There isn't another power tool in your arsenal that really is designed to do that. So what I need to do here is figure out the depth that I want to go to. I'll make a relatively shallow cut here. The way that I set that depth of cut is, on this particular router, is the distance between this stop and the stop at the base. So, once again, our little checklist. Is the router set up? Yes, I have a straight bit. It's a 1/2 inch straight bit. I've decided on the depth of my cut, so I've set that. Is my workpiece secure? This workpiece is held between bench dogs once again. Is my jig set up? Yes, I've set this up to be in the center of the leg, and I've put stops on either end so that it confines the distance of travel. And again, this may seem trivial in this case, but is my pathway clear? The little pathway that I have, yes, it is clear. I can move back and forth cleanly. And finally, I'll be ready when I put my earmuffs on. Again, I was letting the router come to a halt before I took it off. And I'm putting that in front of the camera. is the sequence of cut for a plunge cut is to plunge down to start up the motor, let it come to full speed, plunge down, do your cut, come back out, and then turn off the motor, rather than turning it off while it's still in the plunge position. So that's a nice, safe sequence to follow. And so we have the start of the mortise, and then with successive passes, you could make this much deeper if you needed to. So those are a few of the jigs that you might consider using to get more out of your router. We have a few more over here, which I'll just briefly show. Let's see. We need onto that one. There we go. This is a homemade circle cutting jig. So again, there are a lot of variations on this that you'll find, but the basic idea in every one of them is to have a pivot point and a place to connect your router. So your router would be here, and you would pivot around and be able to make an arc or a circle, and then by adjusting the length here, you can adjust the diameter of the circle that you're making. One little feature of this particular jig is that rather than drilling a hole in your work to put a pin in, that you could take a base like this and double stick tape it to your work surface, and then stick that pivot point in there and use it that way. So, circle cutting jig. And then there's a whole world of opportunity that you can open up by using guide bushings. A guide bushing, let's see, can we go to one of these closer up ones? So a guide bushing connects to your router base and will follow a pattern. So for example, if you wanted to make a keyhole pattern, or sometimes called a butterfly key, like this, having a template like this and the guide bushing will guide you around to make that pattern. And you can use the same concept for any other kind of pattern. This is just a simple, quick homemade jig for cutting out a hinge pattern for a door hinge, and you can clamp this on the edge of your door and cut the recess for a hinge. And here's another use for the guide bushing. Let's say you wanted to make a series of holes for shelf holders for a bookshelf, so that you can adjust the level of the bookshelves. Well, a simple way to do that is to have a jig like this set up, and then you go along with your router and just at each hole drill the hole, and that way you don't have to mark out all of those holes individually and go to the drill press and try to line up the drill press every time and get it to operate. This will give you a very accurate way of doing those holes. And I give credit here to John Cochran, who's been assisting me tonight. He's my off-camera co-producer here, and John and I have taught several router classes in the past together, and I really appreciate John's help on putting this together. And finally, at the very outset of the presentation, I was doing an edge profile, and I was using this base on my router. What this does is it gives you more leverage to control your router, because when you're on the edge, of course, over half of your router is off of the workpiece. But by extending this, you can get more leverage and control your router and keep it from tipping over. So we've gone over a number of ideas for using your router. I hope if you have a router in a box somewhere in your basement that you haven't been using, that you'll get inspired to actually take it out of the box and do something with it. And if you have questions, I can field more questions now, or if you have questions later, you can reach me at email here, dmobley, M-O-B-L-E-Y, at windhoverstudios.com, all one word. So I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them. And just in general, I'd say take advantage of the resources in NWA to learn about routers and other equipment. NWA is all about sharing knowledge and sharing information and helping each other learn how to do woodworking better. So seek out those people who are expert in different areas, and get to know them, and learn other things that you can be doing. And if you're an expert yourself, pitch in and help teach others. Irv, did we have any other questions coming in? Okay. Well, I appreciate your attention. Thanks again to John, and thanks to Carl and Irv and Steve who helped put this production together.
And thank you, Dave. And this brings our presentation to a close tonight. Thanks for tuning in. And remember that we are having an amazing time at the end of March in Saratoga. Showcase, you'll see beautiful artworks, and totally turning if you choose to be a woodturner. Thank you.